A widowed man watches his late wife's body decompose to cope, but when he loses access to her grave he finds comfort in her twin sister and a business partner from her grave. KH watches the body of Becca, his recently departed wife. Seeing his love waste away torments him, so he screams. The man wakes from his nightmare as he's being examined by his dentist Drivehorfer, who believes that his grief is making his teeth rot. KH doubts this, but the man notes that the body reacts to every emotion. The dentist expresses sympathy for Becca's passing, but the widower merely wonders if their clinic still has her dental records. Horfer confirms and offers to send him copies, but he refuses. KH later goes on a blind date with MNA at the restaurant he owns. She wonders why he built it in a graveyard, so the man explains that he also owns the cemetery since it's his showroom for his invention called the Shrouds. Since his wife's untimely demise, he's had a strong desire to join her in her grave. Meanwhile, Becca's religion believed that a body must be allowed to gradually decompose to convince its soul to move on, and so he buried the woman in his cemetery and reserved the plot next to hers for himself. KH then shows MNA his wife's grave, which has stones that include a screen. Using the grave tech app, mourners can connect to the shrouds, a cloth made with cameras that covers the dead so their loved ones can see their remains in real time. MNA is shocked by its morbidity, yet KH continues to show her the app's new feature which allows them to zoom into the remains in high resolution. This makes him feel like he's in the grave with Becca, oddly comforting him. MNA tries to sympathize before excusing herself to hide her discomfort while she's away. KH takes a closer look at his wife's remains and notices something the next day. KH visits Terry, Becca's twin sister. The woman quickly assumes that his date didn't go well, blaming his successful marriage for his lack of practice with flirting. The man asserts that he's not trying to replace his wife, so she points out that he's only hanging out with her since she resembles Becca. KH doesn't deny this, though he wonders why she's settling for a dog grooming job after getting her veterinary license. Terry admits that the medical field makes her nervous, reminding him of how she believed that during her treatment the hospital was pressuring Becca into trying experimental procedures which ended her life. With this in mind, KH asks her to see Becca's remains. The woman refuses as she finds it creepy that her brother-in-law is stalking her sister in her grave. KH insists that he saw something in her sister's grave and could use her medical background to understand what it is. Pressured, Terry looks at what seems to be growths in Becca's skull. She thinks it's a tracking device, claiming that doctors can make such things look organic like the growths. However, KH suggests that it's radiation from the shroud's cameras. He soon receives the report that someone desecrated their graves. The man quickly heads to the warehouse where Gray explains that someone turned off the security cameras last night and vandalized the area. She then received a video of the aftermath this morning. However, they haven't called the police to avoid alerting the media. At Gray's suggestion, KH invites their previous technician and Terry's ex-husband Maury to his home that evening. The man notices the warehouse security feed on one of KH's computers, so he wonders why he didn't call him to set up a home station. He excuses that the repairman he hired for the apartment offered to do it at no extra cost, but my worries that someone else gained access to their security. The cemetery owner proceeds to show the video of the vandalized graves, adding that he can't access Becca's shroud anymore. This means the other mourners of the damaged graves can't access theirs either. KH admits that he recently partnered with another company to obtain 8K resolution images, so the upgrade might have overloaded the system. However, he hopes that the vandalism is just a coincidence. With that, he asks Maury to help him regain access while the man begins his work. He also asks how Honey has been. KH claims that she's driving him crazy, so the man offers to turn her into a koala bear. Later, KH accesses his Honey app and asks the AI to set up a meeting for him with Dr. Akala, his late wife's former oncologist. Late that evening, the widower dreams about Becca going to her doctor at night, explaining that he needs to examine her chest. The following morning, Maury reports that hackers have created a lock screen to prevent access to the shrouds. The screen has symbols similar to those in Viking funeral rites, so he believes the hackers are from Iceland. Hearing this, Carr shares that his company is in talks to create a grave tech site in Iceland, so this attack might be a protest. Honey soon reports that Akala disappeared after attending a conference in Iceland. Suspicious of the recent recent events, the man requests to meet one of the oncologist's colleagues who also worked on Becker's case. He later visits the graves with Mai. Before doing so, the technician sharply asks KH if he has ever slept with Terry. The man adamantly denies this, though he admits that he momentarily thought of it because he misses his wife. Finally, the two check on the cemetery and see that it's unlikely to have been done by religious protesters, given that they had tools to get past security. KH also notices that the group seem to have only vandalized certain graves, including Becker's, while his late wife's gravestone isn't damaged. The wires underneath were dug up and cut. Mai also notices markings on the cables, which suggests that the group hacked into the system using a splitter before cutting the wires. That evening, KH researches a Hungarian businessman named Sabo. Before meeting his wife Sumin, Sabo is dying and wants to be buried using grave tech in his home country. With this, the woman extends her husband's proposal to invest in the business's expansion in Budapest. Sumin, however, is blind, so she doesn't see the point of having a screen on her husband's grave. KH hints that they're developing a tactile response to allow the mourners to touch the deceased, which might benefit her. Dismissing this, Sumin plays Sabo's recording wherein he shares the Hungarian government's concern that grave tech might be used as a cover for Russia to install surveillance on them. If this is possible, then her husband won't invest in the project because of this. KH later asks Gray if these fears are possible. She admits that if their system is hacked, there's a chance that their transmission can be rerouted to act as surveillance on the mourners. The widower insists on getting Sabo's investment, so he orders the woman to look into strengthening their system. After arriving home, KH feels lonely because he hasn't seen his wife's body in days, and so he puts on the shroud he reserved for himself to get the feel of what it's like. This allows his system to have a full image of his body. Honey activates and reminds him that Becca never felt what it's like to be in the shroud. Instead, she offers an update to cheer him up. She sets a meeting for him with Dr. Zhao the next day. Having been one of Becca's doctors, the physician checks the fragments KH saw in her skeleton and assumes that it's growth triggered by her chemotherapy. Xiao also figures that the widower is connected with Shining Cloth Technologies, a Chinese company that also develops imaging devices for their hospital. KH hesitantly admits that he was worried that the growths were caused by a military procedure similar to Terry's conspiracy theories. He also wonders if they developed while Becca was buried, which Zhao doubts since bone and cancer cells die along with the host. Unconvinced, KH asks if the doctor saw such fragments during his wife's treatments, but the man admits that he can't remember. Her scans can only be accessed by her main doctor Ricola, whom Xiao thinks is just extending his vacation since he was in the middle of a divorce with nothing else to offer. Zhao requests copies of the images of Becca's remains so he can study them. After this, Honey schedules KH to meet Sumin at a hotel. Sumin asks what he's doing about the Hungarian government's concern with grave tech, but he admits that there's little he can do since their technology touches science, religion and politics. The woman then changes the subject and asks to touch her guest's face, reminding him of his promised tactile feature for the shrouds. KH humors her, and as Sumin studies his face, she mentions how her husband hasn't touched her since he got sick. The widower empathizes with her since after Becca's immune system got worse during her therapy, they were afraid to make contact for fear of infection. Even before then, he couldn't touch her since her bones had become too fragile, making intimacy impossible. That evening, KH dreams about his wife's return after her procedure. To his shock, the doctors removed one of her arms and chest since the muscles were degrading. He mourned his wife's condition, and to prove that she was still capable, Becca initiated intimacy, promising that she wasn't too fragile. However, before they could even start, his wife broke her hip. In the present, KH wakes up next to Sumin after their night together. As he prepares to leave, the woman warns him not to trust Honey. She noticed that the avatar glitched when she contacted her, so she had her code looked at and found that someone may be controlling the AI. Because of this, when KH works the following day, he rejects Honey's offer to assist him. He even turns off his phone and fishes out an old device. Sumin later shares with KH that her husband worries that grave tech's Chinese manufacturers have deeper control over the shrouds. The woman agrees that with the shrouds being made in China, their government might use them for espionage. As they walk, they chance upon Terry, who is isn't pleased to see the blind woman with her ex-in-law that night. KH dreams about Becca again, this time after her hip surgery. She shared that Ekla kept her amputated parts for his medical presentation as her degrading bones were important for his research. Becca saw this as her disease having meaning even when she was withering away, but her husband found this suspicious. KH invites Terry to his apartment the following evening. She quickly asks if he's sleeping with Simon, and the man confesses, defending that she's helped him through his grief. He then asks about his late wife's relationship with Ekla. Terry knows that her sister dated him when she was his student. KH doubts it was a coincidence that Becca ended up being her ex-boyfriend's patient, feeling jealous that he practically had control over her body in her final days. With this, he asks if his wife was cheating on him with her doctor. Terry awkwardly defends her sister, but KH suggests that Ekla was doing unethical research, and Becca, who still loved him, consented to be his guinea pig. Oddly, hearing him finally agree to her fears has Terry seeing her brother-in-law in a new light. She hints that her ex might even urged her to visit Kay alone to see if something would happen between them. With this, the two become intimate. During this, the woman mentions that her former husband likely wanted something to happen between them so he could justify his jealousy. The following day, KH visits Maury, who has recovered data from the shrouds on the night of the vandalism. This had him discover that the bones from the vandalized graves had the same growths as Becca's, those that were untouched didn't, meaning the attacks were targeted, likely to destroy evidence from those bones. To investigate, KH has Honey organize a meeting with the relatives of those whose graves were vandalized. As the AI reports back, however, she provokes him by appearing like Becca after her surgeries. She also teases about how Ekla kept amputated parts of his late wife, wondering if he'd like those back. Honey then reveals that the 9 other people whose graves were desecrated were Ekla's patients. Angered, KH goes to Maury, but the man isn't home. Instead, he finds his ex-wife in his apartment, who recorded herself confronting the man earlier. Her ex-husband had threatened to end his life if Terry didn't return to him. He accused her and Kay of manipulating him, knowing that they'd spent the night together because he was controlling Honey. In fact, Honey wasn't an AI but only an avatar for him who pretended to be KH's assistant. He did this to blackmail his ex-in-law, but she doubted he could do this since she'd known him to be a coward. To prove that he wasn't, Maury admitted that he vandalized the cemetery. The following day, the ruined graves had been exhumed and examined to prepare them for reshrouding and re-burial. Becca's remains were also dug up, but KH refuses to see her yet. Gray believes that some of the relatives would opt out of the shrouds and just bury their loved ones in normal graves. She asks if KH would consider this, but he thinks his late wife should be reconnected to the shroud for the company. He then meets Zhao, who reports that the growths weren't organic nor were they caused by the shrouds. They were instead implanted digitally, making him suspect Maury further. To his surprise, the man calls him in his car later and tells him to follow the location he sent to his navigation system. He admits that he worked with the Russians when he sabotaged Grave Tech, and now all of them may face the consequences. My begs that he can fix things if KH meets him, so with no choice he heads to the indicated location in the forest. His former brother-in-law admits that he hired young Russian hackers to hack into Grave Tech, but this led Shining Cloth Technologies to think that he was sabotaging them on behalf of the Russians. The Chinese were apparently using the shrouds to establish espionage on Western countries, proving the use of shrouds to monitor the remains. The manufacturers aimed to expand their products for use on the living. Still doubting his word, KH accuses him of digitally placing the growths on the remains to make him think that it's all connected to Ekla. However, Maury figures out that Xiao, a Chinese doctor, was the one who told him this, explaining that Xiao also works for Shining Cloth Technologies. Ekla was also in on this, having been paid to experiment on patients including Becca. He likely fled the country since the Chinese government was looking for him to prove that they were also after him. Maury reveals his mutilated hand, claiming that he was kidnapped and tortured into agreeing to be mole against the Russians. However, Maury wasn't part of their operations. He just hired hackers to sabotage the cemetery owner. If he can't give them anything, they'd likely end his life, so he needs to flee the country. That evening, KH shares the these claims to Terry, who doesn't believe the story. She points out that his missing fingers were from an old accident that he just never noticed. They do agree that Maury was the one who forged the growths on the remains. Given that the man is also a conspiracy theorist, KH realizes that his former wife is excited about such topics. With this, he asks why she broke up with him, and Terry explains that it's because Maury was foolish. They soon check the cemetery and see that all the graves are operational again. KH had apparently convinced Maury to fix the system. If the shrouds were back up, the Chinese would leave him alone since they could use the cameras again. However, they found that the plot meant for KH had been dug up to check if a body was buried. The KH checks the grave tech app and discovers that a recently murdered Ickler is buried next to Becca. The widower wonders if Maury created a digital mock-up of Ickler to taunt him, doubting that he would have access to his body. The event, however, has made Terry wonder if her ex-husband's Chinese conspiracy was real. Another option would be that Ickler's wife found out about his relationship with Becca, so she killed him and buried him next to her in spite. Strangely, KH decides to keep the man in his grave, hinting that he might have had the doctor killed for taking his wife from him, then buried them together. Discussing such theories excites Terry again, so she asks to get intimate. Days later, the cemetery owner joins some in as she escorts her late husband's body to his funeral. She hints that by using grave tech, all of Sabo's friends would be flying to Budapest to see him. KH mentions that he doesn't have enough people in his life to do this for him, so Summon offers to get him new friends in Budapest. She even teases that he can live with her if he decides to move to Hungary. During their flight, the widower suddenly finds Summon having the same scars as his late wife. She accuses him of breaking his promise